this is your first animated film in 11 years, which is incredible. This is one of the best animated films of the year, for sure. What do you think changed in your style, your approach to animation in those 11 years? What remained the same? Do you see any similarities or differences in what you were going for?
Each film I've worked on is it's like a snowball. You accumulate knowledge, both things that maybe you don't want to do again and things that you want to remember for the next time. And this film for sure is an accumulation of everything I've learned from when I started on the piece. I'd say that in the time since I last worked in animation, huge advances came along that allowed us to do this illustrated style. And it was so incredibly lucky that I arrived and this arrived all at the same time. Lucky for me, I should say, because as I read Peter Brown's book, which is deceptively, I think, simple in some ways. I shouldn't say simple, accessible, because it's animals and a robot. But the feelings inside it are very complex and very big. And so I felt that there was a certain level of sophistication that had to be maintained in order for this film not to, I think, go too young for view. I wanted anybody who sees this film on a poster or a TV ad or whatever to think maybe this is for me to see, because I wouldn't want anybody to miss out on seeing this film and seeing Peter's story. So we were, in a way, gravitationally held to a certain CG look, just technologically. And with Puss in Boots, The Last Wish, and Bad Guys, DreamWorks had made some huge advances in getting a more illustrated look on screen. And we were looking to push that way further. Tyrus Wong's styling in Bambi was one of our inspirations. And Miyazaki's Forests, another inspiration of ours. So as we were doing development work and doing exploration in different moments of the film, Daniel Kaku's artwork, and he was he was working in France, and we identified his paintings, which were very impressionistic, as our target. So we began to engineer things to reach that exact look. And there was a final painting that we had, and the goal was to make that painting move. And so each element of it was being developed, and eventually it came into color dailies one day. And someone pushed a button, and I thought I was looking at that painting again, but it then began to move, and I realized they'd achieved it. And so I think that's one of the things, and goodness gracious, just as I was about to mention music, Kris arrived. That and the music are two of the huge reasons I think that this film operates at the altitude, if you will, that it does.
When you're talking about making the film for everyone, and then it's also exploring emotion in a very unique way, how do you feel about the main character not being human, and none of the characters being human? I think in your past films, Lilo and Stitch, Beauty and the Beast, there is a non-human character that's exhibiting emotion. How did you approach that in The Wild Robot? What makes that maybe more accessible to adults and kids, and how does music play a role in describing emotion throughout that language as well?
I'll start with Robot, and then I'll hand it to you. One of the things that actually my wife Jess identified and pointed out is that robots, because I always felt like robots are very, very good at telling human stories, so are animals. And she pointed out that robots are actually missing a lot of things. They don't have an age. They don't have. They usually don't have gender. They don't have regionality. Anything that might distract you from the core emotional story. So there's a purity to them. And I would say the same thing goes for animals, particularly when they're being handled as animals. In animation, animals frequently drive cars and have jobs, and we love that. When I draw an animal, it's usually in a car or something. But in this case, they were missing all those things, and again, there's a real purity to that allows you to get really very, very close to them.
Yeah, I think something that was really fascinating about my first conversation when I first went to visit Kris at the studio was he talked about the capability of music to help tell a story, and mentioned a scene in Lilo and Stitch where there's a cue that Alan Silvestri wrote that happens that musically suggests this change internally for Stitch and his understanding of what's going on with Lilo. And understanding or excitement around what music can do to help tell a story in a wordless moment really spoke to the reason why I fell in love with music in the first place with film and media, where you had composers that were aware of that and therefore were very intentional with how to craft and develop themes over the course of the film. And so, there are moments where a really amazing moment happens in the story and you feel overwhelmed with emotion. I feel largely in those instances because the music is also reprising this musical idea that's been seeded and developed. And so in those first conversations where Kris talked about carving out what you call houses for music and moments where music would help tell that story about dialogue with minimal dialogue, that then said to me that it was going to be very important that we had very clear melodic themes and musical ideas that were developed so that you feel those things in this subconscious way over the course of the movie. And so, I usually watch movies for a while to decide where those things should happen. And watching this, it felt clear that obviously Roz and Brightville and Finch should have very individual themes, but you should also do this main theme for this idea of family, because there are moments like the migration sequence or at the end of the film where it's not really just one of them dealing with something, we're kind of looking at this larger idea. And having that in mind, it became about working with each moment to decide what theme is being developed here, how do we change it so that we're following Roz's, shift from more robotic to more human with the music over the course of her melodic statement and same with the main theme, and kind of look at it as this big picture as well.
I want to expand on that, the transition from being less robotic to more human. That's also a theme in Lilo and Stitch, and you just talked about looking at that scene where Stitch, there's this like epiphany almost. So how do you approach the writing process of, do you plan out, do you know when you're going to have that moment where it starts to become more human, or does that just kind of come in the flow of the writing? In this film, there's like not that much dialogue, but the dialogue is extremely powerful, so you have a line in mind of like, this is going to be the moment.
Yeah, you have targets for those things. One of the wonderful things about animation is that it's wonderful because it takes so incredibly long. And that's actually a strength. It's a marathon. So you, in the scripting, you have your targets, you have the structure, and you have where these things are going to happen. Inevitably, it will be resculpted and it will adjust itself as if you're being sensitive to the story. And eventually, these films begin to tell you what they want. They become much bigger than you. I always liken it to like a giant freight train, and you start by like trying to slip the boiler, and you push it along, and eventually it starts running. And before you know it, you're running alongside, and it's telling you where it's going and what it wants if you're listening to it. So you'll make adjustments. And Lilo and Stitch, it's a story of a villain that becomes a hero. It's a redemption story. I think it's the first one that Disney really ever did. But it's much more subtle in The Wild Robot, and it begins from the very, very start. And Lupita actually created that voice, and that voice changes, and it's very evident in the scene where she's in the graveyard in the cave, and she's talking to herself, but she's talking to her version 1 self. And so Lupita's transition was very, very subtle. By the time you arrive at the scene where they're in the lodge, and she's talking to these animals about, this is the moment of truth, you're going to have to change your programming, and I'm going to shut down, so you're on your own for a moment here. And by the time you get there, you're fully there, but I don't think you realize when exactly it happened. It happened slowly. And that is something that Lupita really took the lead in deconstructing and understanding and then creating Roz's architecture, the way her brain works. And along with that was the sound of her voice. So she's got this sort of Alexa programmed optimistic hello that she does at the beginning. She's like, I think she kind of stresses her voice to get there. And then, so we have a phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 voice that is evident with Roz. And that tracks along with where she is emotionally. And just really quickly, one of the things that we did add that was not in the book, that little transmitter that pops out the top of her head, that's not there just for convenience. That is literally an indication of where she is emotionally in the story. If she activates it, she's willing to leave. But the way that she activates it is also important because at the beginning she wants to activate it immediately. She realizes she's in the wrong place, she's going to activate it, she's going to leave. She has no emotional connection to the place. But at a certain point, it breaks, of course, and she's compelled to stay. By the time she replaces it, and that's one of the reasons that we have that sequence, I added that, the bit in the cave, so that she could get that transmitter back, amongst other things, see where she was supposed to really be. By the time she gets it back, she doesn't activate it. She's debating it. So now you know that she's on the fence. She's wobbling about whether she belongs there or not. So it's one of those things that we added to help you understand that emotional curve.
We talked a little bit about how Roz's character transcends what we expect from robots or what we expect to be human. But your side characters, all the animal characters, are so like well, they all have their own personalities. How did you use the expectations one might have of a bear or a mule or a goose to tell those stories, to like build those characters and have them be part of the larger lesson?
Yeah, and you should talk about the themes as well, because several of them have their very own dedicated themes that help you understand exactly who they are. Think in particular, they all have their roles. Some characters I paired out of the book. The bear was 3 bears, and in the movie it's 1. There's a character named Chit Chat who's very popular in the book, and he's a great character. But Chit Chat was pulled out because it would interfere with Roz and Bright Bill's relationship. Fink, I had immediately identified as being, he needed to be bigger than he was in the book. And he becomes representative of all the animals on the island, the spokesperson, if you will. And he has that line where he says, you gotta learn how things work on this island. And the next line he says, and kindness is not a survival skill. That's actually something that Peter Brown, the author, revealed to us when we had our very first conversation with him over the phone, over Zoom. He said that as he was writing the book, there was this guiding principle in his head, which was that kindness could be a survival skill, but it was never memorialized in the pages of the book. And I wrote that down off screen and thought, okay, I'm going to put that on screen. So you just have to weigh out which characters are going to be load bearing as far as being important to the film. And the last thing I'll say is that you have to do that because a book is a boat. It can hold a lot. I think of it as a container ship, because a book is something you can consume, you digest it at your own pace. If you're a fast reader, immediately. If you're a slow reader, maybe months. But a film has to be an airplane. It has to be lightweight. It's only going to be in the air for an hour and a half. So you have to jettison things in order to make it sleek and maneuverable. So that's why you have to pair these things out. And it's a hard thing to do because there are certain things you love about the book, but it's a necessity if you're going to be successful.
Yeah, I think it was fun to try to figure out how to capture the emotion and essence of these characters, the animals in particular, through those themes. Think about Fink, for example, and how we first meet him. He's this very sly, cunning, foxy fox. And with that, what was interesting is when I first considered what his theme would be, I thought it would have a bit more darkness to it, and then actually hearing Pedro's performance made me feel differently about Fink. I think there's just like a softness and like almost a warmth to his voice, even though he's being this sly, manipulative character in the beginning. There's something about it that felt light and playful, and so his theme kind of has this almost we said like secret agents, like James Bond villain kind of sound to it when we first meet him. But then at the same time, as he develops as a character, I think about the moment where he's come back during the storm, and there's like a very sweet version of his theme. And then at the very end, when he says that line of, what if I have something to tell you and you're not here, it's his theme again. And so it's, developing the melody so that the first instance has a lot of the character of what this character feels like, where there's this like unorthodox percussion and this like brassy, deliberate melody and this kind of like fun, playful groove to it, but then having a melody that is clear enough that can then be extracted as the character grows to then present itself in different ways with each instance. And so when you do that thing, the Bright Bill at first is very cute and sweet, but that same theme appears when he's leading all of the beasts out of the Dome City, and it's much more heroic, and that appears again when he leads them to go after the ship. And so, yeah, just trying to find a way to capture the essence and feeling of them in the beginning, but then have that melody be something that can be changed, whether it's like instrumentation-wise or harmonically or any of that, so that we're following the arc of those characters.
One of my favorite things about the movie is that everything feels so intentional, and and it feels like the form is complementing the narrative instead of just like where it is to be. And so that's the animation and the music. So you have this duality of robotic and nature, and it's the most extreme nature, it's the most futuristic robot. And the animation, I know we've talked about this before, it's like paint strokes, and it kind of becomes more and more soft as the film goes on. Did you approach the music a similar way? Why did you approach the animation that way? Was this duality kind of in mind in creating the film?
Yeah, from our first conversation, we talked about that the necessity of music to have both of those elements. And watching it and looking at that hand-painted style, I decided to have the organic be the kind of main sound, but throughout the entire thing, there's synths that are always present. And then with Roz, it was following how she's developing. I found it really fascinating how they were developing her visually, and so sonically, in the beginning, it's a lot of synths and a lot of parts that are very mechanical sounding. It almost sounds like the processing that she's doing on the island. But then over the course of time, there's voices that are introduced only in moments where she's expressing almost a human instinct. Instead of using synth pads in moments where she's kind of feeling emotion, we had this percussion ensemble bow metal instruments, so that there's kind of, it sounds like a synth, but it's actually like bowed metal. And then with the wilderness, I wanted to try to find a different way to represent that, and so I discovered this percussion ensemble called Sandbox Percussion, and they're really fun because they approach percussion more like Foley, where they're playing metal pipes and glass bottles and wood slats and an oxygen tank and like different random things, and they build these percussion sets. And so for me, that was a way to bring the sound of animals skittering through the forest and things like that into the music, where it could be this almost ASMR layer that's on top of the orchestra. And so a lot of times there are these percussion parts that are kind of representing that wilderness in a way that felt a little bit more modern.
The textures are originally painted. The backgrounds and characters are entirely surfaced they are painted digitally, but they're painted by human beings with electronic paintbrushes. And that was the big goal for this whole thing. We deliberately allowed Roz to be that traditional CG look, at least in the very, very beginning, when she first comes out of the crate. Both the crate and she are business as usual as far as a digital look. And that was deliberate, of course, because we want them to look as though they don't belong there. They should stand out in more than just their coloration. But almost immediately we begin to replace Roz with up to, I believe it's 35 or 36 different versions of her. And she becomes, as she gets more dented and scratched, and gets some mildew and things, she's deliberately visually becoming part of the island. She belongs. And so the goal being that when Vontra, the little robot that floats around, Stephanie Shu's character shows up, we have a moment where Roz steps into that light, and it should be a bit of a shock that she looks that degraded. And we also wanted to have her look degraded because the island is wearing on her. She's not surviving in some ways. She's becoming stronger on the inside, but on the outside, she is beginning to leak, and she's getting a lot of damage. One of the things we were very careful with as well is Roz's lights. They indicate, we originally added them just as, just to jazz her up, like, so she looked really cool, like she's very futuristic. They looked really good, but almost immediately the animators began using them to pulse with her voice, and it really just helps the presentation of her dialogue. Also, we immediately started using them to indicate her situation. I always like to look at Roz as a real thing that you could order. So I imagine that in her service manual, it would say that those lights are coded to tell you what's going on with her. So the simplest one being when she's full of power, she's got this nice green sort of teal glow, and then when she's getting low, she goes to a yellow and then eventually to a red when she's low power. But she also goes immediately to red when she's attacked by Thor the Bear, and she's in distress. And if you look very carefully, that little robot, Vontra, as she drifts around Roz, the whole idea that I had in my head is that Universal Dynamics is extremely interested in what's going on with Roz. They're frightened of what's happening. This could be a disaster for the company that she's operational. That probably was never supposed to happen. So that little robot is Roz's viewpoint, she herself is glowing teal green. But the moment she drifts outside of what Roz can see, she goes immediately to red because she's frightened of Roz. But she's trying to keep Roz calm because if Roz doesn't want to get in the spaceship, it's going to be more difficult. So she's all about like calming her down. I also wanted to make sure that she touched Roz a lot, which is like, it's, you know, something you wouldn't do to a stranger, like, oh hey, how you doing? But Roz is like a lawnmower. She's such a product. So I really wanted to make sure that like we treated her instead of like, well, she's like a big washing machine or a refrigerator. So for the company, she's a thing that you want.
I have one last final question for you guys. You guys kind of touched on it. You talked about how Lupita really brought her own voice to Roz and brought that character to life. You talked about how Fink and Pedro's voice changed your perception of that character. So many of our favorite animated films, the voices are what makes them memorable, timeless, and iconic. What were the conversations with Lupita and Pedro? Were they early on in the writing process? Did you know they really wanted them to voice them? Was it something that just kind of came up after? And then how was that conversation going for these characters?
This is where I get to credit Kris Bowers, our casting director. This is something I am not good at. This is her art. And I realized once we really dived into the development of characters that her casting is more than voice stealing. She's really looking at the character of the characters on screen. The conversations with Lupita were immediate. We talked several times before she said yes to doing the film. She wanted to make sure that she was going to be a creative partner in the making of the movie. And our very first recording session in New York City, we talked for over an hour before we ever committed anything to record it. Because again, just understanding how Roz works, and she always had observations and notes, and we would rewrite right there on the spot, and we never stopped rewriting. And we would also come back and revisit the character and do scenes again as we learn more. And I believe this is Pedro's first animated character. So he became more comfortable every session. He would jump into things, and he was exploring it as well because there came this really particular moment. There was a line that he read, and it's no longer in the film. There was a moment that used to be in the story reel where Roz has this little tablet, and on the tablet I had these things that you could scroll through that you could order as accessories. And I thought this would be a funny idea that like, if Fink saw these things, he might scroll through them thinking like how can he enhance his particular robot so that he could dominate the island. And there was something that he saw, it was like a flamethrower or something. And the line was, ooh, can we get that? But he read it, ooh, can we get that? He read it like a kid sitting in a shopping cart pointing at something we were passing by. And I thought, that's Fink. It's like that younger sort of, because even though he's duplicitous and he has his own agenda, he is this really damaged character that's very dimensional. So that became the touchstone, and I think that helped guide forward from there.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for your time. Thank you for making